Hi there, I'm Cal Newport. If you are watching this video, this means that either you pre-ordered my book, Slow Productivity, or someone who did pre-order the book has shared this video link with you. Either way, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Now, I'm calling this video a Slow Productivity Crash Course. My goal is to give you just enough information that you can actually start putting the big ideas of slow productivity into action in your current life, even before you get my book with all of the extra details and explanation that it contains. So this will be your quickest route from getting from zero to having a notable amount of slow productivity in your professional life. Now, here's the way I'm going to structure this. I'm going to start by introducing the concept of slow productivity so you know what we're talking about. I'm then going to go through the three main principles of this philosophy, and for each, pull out a single piece of particularly effective practical advice from my book to detail to you right here. So when we're done with this crash course, you'll not only know what slow productivity is, but you'll have a concrete thing to put into action in your life along the three main principles of this philosophy. Once you have a taste for this, of course, read the book and you'll get a much more nuanced, detailed approach. All right, so let's get started with what slow productivity is. To explain this, let me start with the problem I detected that instigated my study of this issue. It was early pandemic. We're talking 2020, summer 2020, spring 2020. When I began to hear from my podcast listeners and newsletter readers a growing discomfort with the general notion of productivity. Now, as someone who tackles the intersection of digital technology in our lives, and because of that does a lot of writing about the workplace and digital distractions and how to stay productive among digital distractions, this was a topic that was true to my interest. So I began to investigate what's going on here. Why do we have this growing discomfort with the notion of productivity? The answer I found is that we don't really have a sensical definition of what we even mean by productivity. Now, if we look into other economic sectors, productivity is very well defined. If you're a farmer, productivity is clear. Bushels produced per acre of land. You can measure it. You can give it a number. You can experiment with different agricultural systems and see how they impact this number. In industrial manufacturing, productivity is precisely defined. How many Model Ts per man-hour of labor are we producing? You can measure this. You can put a number on it. When you change the way you build your cars, when you switch, let's say, from the craft message to the assembly line, you can see that number get better. But then we get knowledge work. This is something that emerges as a major economic sector really in the mid-20th century. It's 1959 that the term knowledge work itself is first coined by Peter Drucker. When we get the knowledge work, productivity gets a little bit more hazy. It's not so clear to define. If you take the average knowledge worker, someone today that works at a computer screen somehow associated with an office or some sort of business that produces mainly products out of the human brain, what do we measure? There's no bushels of wheat we can just tabulate or numbers of Model Ts that were produced for a given number of labor hours. Most knowledge workers actually do multiple different types of things. Their jobs have multiple roles and multiple types of work products. It's typically not comparable from one worker to another. So what I do might be different than the exact sort of things that you're producing. There's also not clearly defined systems in knowledge work. If I run a factory, I can tell you exactly how I build cars. In knowledge work, the tools you use to organize your own efforts are up to you. They're not written down somewhere. They're not somewhere that we can study and say this way of working is producing these type of results. So productivity didn't really work in the ways we were used to thinking about this concept in the world of knowledge work. So what do we do? Because we have managers. We have to manage something. So what did we do about this problem? Well, early in my book, I argue we invented a clever new concept that I call pseudo-productivity. Pseudo-productivity said, let's use visible activity as a proxy for useful labor. So if I see you doing something, that's better than not seeing you do something. And that'll be the best way that we can approximate, useful labor. So I want to see you here in the office doing things. If you're goofing off too much, I will be mad. If our company needs to turn itself around, we'll do so by saying, be here longer. I want to see you in the office more. This was pseudo-productivity. This was the implicit law of the land in knowledge work since at least the mid-century. And it worked okay. It's not a very accurate way of measuring labor, but whatever. When the boss comes around, put down the magazine. If you're at the water cooler, pretend like you were talking about work instead of sports. It's fine. But then something else happened. The tech revolution, what I call the front office IT transformation. We got computers, we got networks, we got mobile commuting, we got laptops and smartphones, we got email, and we got chat. And now suddenly pseudo-productivity became unsustainable. We had more possible work to do than we ever could handle. We had the ability to do this work in any situation, not just when we were in an office building. We could interact with people about this work at any point. The combination of more work is better than less, and you have endless work you can do at any point, that was combustible. That began leading to this ubiquity of our jobs, this sense of work following us everywhere, this sense of more and more work could come at us through tools like email, so we had more and more things on our plate. Burnout and exhaustion began to follow. By the time we get to the pandemic, this just gets amplified even worse, and people said, I've had enough. I don't know what productivity is, but I do know this urge I have to always have to be doing more work is killing me, and I'm done with it. That was the stage that led to slow productivity. So what is slow productivity? It's an alternative definition of this concept. Pseudo-productivity does not work for knowledge work in an age of digital networks. We need to explore alternative definitions of productivity that can, A, produce really impressive, useful, profitable results, whatever it is we're actually trying to do, professionally speaking, and B, be sustainable. Us human beings can pursue the definition and not get burnt out, but instead get energized. Slow productivity was my attempt to come up with that definition. And the way I came up with this definition is inspired by the slow food movement. I said, let's go back and study how people have solved this problem before. And I went back, and in the book, I study what I call traditional knowledge workers, people historically who produce things with their mind, but due to historical circumstances had a ton of flexibility in how they did it. Poets, scientists, writers, artists, people who had maybe patronage to pay their bills, or they didn't have to work and they could do their art full time, or their art was very successful, so they got lots of flexibility. I was looking for people that were in this rare historical circumstance of I'm trying to build things with my mind, and I have complete flexibility to see what works and what didn't. I then draw from these historical examples to isolate some key principles and then adapt them to knowledge work in the 21st century, to adapt them to the constraints of I'm an entrepreneur and I have clients who need things, to adapt them to the constraints of I work for an office and my boss doesn't care and needs things from me. So just like the slow food movement retrieved food culture from traditional approaches to food, I am trying to build a more sustainable and effective notion of productivity by pulling from these traditional knowledge work cultures. The definition I came up with is built around three principles. It says the right way to produce impressive work in a way that's sustainable and energizing is to build your work around three principles. Number one, do fewer things. Number two, work at a natural pace. Number three, obsess over quality. These three things together is a much more humane, a much more sustainable, a much more intuitive, natural way to produce work that we really are impressed by, work that we really love. It's a much better alternative to pseudo-productivity. So here's what I want to do now moving forward in this crash course. We're going to go through those three principles one by one, and for each I will give you a specific piece of concrete advice from my book so you can start putting some of that principle into action in your life right away. All right, make sense? Let's get rolling. Let's start with the first principle of slow productivity, which is to do fewer things. Now, here's the motivation for this principle. It is easy in our current age of digital communication for people just to push work your direction. Hey, Cal, can you do this? Can you get back to me on this? Hey, what do you know about this? Hey, can you jump on a call and help me schedule what's going on with this upcoming client? The average knowledge worker today has significantly more obligations to which they're committed at any one time than it was, let's say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We have more on our plate right now than ever before. Now, there's a real cost to this, and I detail this in my book, but there's a real cost to having too much to do. And the reason is every obligation you've committed to that's on your task list brings with it what I call an overhead tax. So long as that commitment is on your plate, there is a certain amount of administrative work required from you to keep this task alive. This might be emails about it, people checking in on how it's going. It might be weekly status meetings that you have to jump on as long as this obligation is active. It's also just a cognitive overhead tax of, I know this is something I've committed to do, and it's there somewhere in the back of my head. There's a little voice like, okay, this is here. We have this thing to do. We're not working on it right now. This is a problem. So because everything you commit to do brings with it this overhead tax, the more things you put on your plate, the more time is dedicated to paying overhead tax. So there's actually a cost to having 50 things on your to-do list versus 10. Even if you're only working on one thing per day, regardless of whether you have 10 or 50, it makes a difference. This quantity makes a difference because of the overhead tax. Eventually, what happens when you've agreed to do too many things is that you spend more and more of your time paying the overhead tax, going to status meetings, answering emails, just thinking in the back of your mind about all you have to do. More and more of your time gets spent on the tax. Less of this time gets spent actually doing the work, and you fall farther behind. More things pile. The amount of overhead tax increases. It can be a really nasty overload spiral that you can fall into. So you really want to be doing fewer things. That's a key property to slowing down in your approach to work. There's a lot of ways to do this. I want to give you here one particular piece of advice that comes out of the book that I think is delightfully provocative. And that is using what I'm going to call a public pull list. P-U-L-L. All right, let me explain to you how this works. The typical way that someone can put work on your plate is what we would call the push model. I have this thing I want Cal to do. Boom, I push it onto his plate. I don't have to worry about it anymore. Maybe I'll bother him occasionally like, hey, have you done this yet? In fact, I'll be annoyed if you don't do this right away because I want you to do this. I pushed it to you. You are the person I'm waiting for on to get this back, and so this is sort of on your shoulders. So yeah, hey, I pushed something to you. Where's my thing? The alternative approach to work is pulling, P-U-L-L-I-N-G. Instead of letting everyone just push things onto my plate that I'm now juggling, I pull things onto my plate when I'm ready to work on something else. Now, from a cognitive perspective, pull systems in general are clearly much better because you're minimizing overhead tax. I'm only working on a small number of things at a time, so the amount of overhead tax I'm paying at any one time is constrained. And when I'm done, I pull in something else. Now, here's the thing. This is not reducing the total amount of work that you produce. Because even if you have everything on your plate at the same time, you can only spend so much time working on one thing at a time, right? I mean, you're not, the amount of time you spend working on things actually will probably be larger in a pull system because you're spending less time paying overhead tax. So the amount of things you actually finish in a month in a pull system might be much larger than if you took all of these things and put them on your plate all at once and you had to waste so much time just juggling the admin. So a pull-based system in general, it's not only going to make you feel much better and slow things down, you're probably going to get more work done. So how do we implement a pull-based system? Well, in my book, I give a really intricate, complicated approach for how an individual who works inside of a large company can stealthily implement a pull system in a way that people don't even know you're doing it, but it gives you many of the advantages. Here, I want to give you a more direct way of doing it. This is something that can be deployed if you have either the flexibility or the chutzpah to actually try this. I think it's a cool idea. Here's how it works. You have a public shared document. This is your project list. It's divided. At the top of the list, you have pending or waiting. And at the bottom, under some sort of horizontal divider, actively working on. You have no more than one or two things that you're actively working on. Everything else goes above it. So here's what happens now. When someone says, hey, Cal, can you do this for me? You say, okay, if it sounds reasonable. Yeah, I could do this project for you. Add it to the end of my queue. Show them the document. So yeah, just type, add it to the top of the list. Make sure you include under it any information I need or pointers, or whatever I need to actually make progress on this once time comes to work on it. So already you're putting the onus on their plate. They can't just asymmetrically push this to you. Hey, work on this, Cal, period, send, I'm done. They have to write it down. They have to give you all the information. This itself, that step itself might clear out some obligations they might give up. More importantly, however, they see transparently your workload. Oh, there's 5 other projects ahead of me in this queue. And down at the bottom is what Cal's working on right now. So now I know where my project stands and how much work Cal actually has. Now that alone also is going to clear out more projects before they actually make it onto your plate, because when they get to this list and they see the 5 things you have, they say, you know what? You're busy. I'm not going to bother with you this now. So half of the incoming projects disappear when people have to confront what they are doing to your list. You already have all these things. They're adding something new. For the projects that remain, you now have transparency on their status. So you can say to this person, hey, keep an eye on this document. I update this as I work on new things. I move them down to the active, and I move everything else down in the waiting queue. So at any time you have a question about where am I on this project, just go to that shared document and you'll see where it is. You don't have to email me. You don't have to bother me. You can see it. Now you can now, as the person executing this work, you can now comfortably work on one thing at a time, pull in the next thing when it's done. Everyone else who's given you work can see their status, and if they feel guilty, they can take these things off your plate. It's very hard for them to complain. The only complaint they can give is, I think my thing should be a higher priority than something else. And okay, that's a fair argument. Let them make it. And if they're right, you can swap the priority, but they probably won't make that argument. The other argument they can make is, I want you to work on all these at the same time. But there's a clear response to that. That's stupid. Why would I work at 6 things concurrently? I need to do these one at a time. It'll be much faster overall. There is a hard logic to what you're doing here that's hard to push back against. All right, so using this shared pull list is a fantastic way, if not a little bit deliberately provocative, to shift the way you think about workload management. No, you can't just throw stuff on my plate. I'll pull stuff when I'm ready. This is one of many ways to take a step towards this first principle of slow productivity: work on fewer things. All right, let's talk now about the second principle of slow productivity, which is to work at a natural pace. Now, in my book, I identify multiple issues with the way we think about the timing of our work. And there's 2 issues in particular that I want to highlight here. One, we use the wrong time scales when measuring productivity. So we often think about, how productive was I today? And if I wasn't busy all day long, working on lots of different things and making progress on lots of different things, I'll say to myself, I was not productive today. However, when we study people who actually produce things of real value, people that we really admire for their creative knowledge work skills, the time scales at which they're productive are often much longer. We care not what they did last week. We cared what they produced over the last 20 years. I open my book, for example, on John McPhee. Now, by any reasonable standard of productivity, the writer John McPhee is productive. He's written something like 25 or more books. He's won a Pulitzer Prize for one of them. He's been nominated for National Book Awards twice. He's been one of the most famed writers for The New Yorker since 1969 and has been writing regularly for them ever since. He's in his 90s right now. Incredibly productive writing career. But I highlight in the book a story about him working on a particular famous article of him And he told the story of working on this article. And the story of working on this particular article involved a 5-day period where all he did towards this article was lay on his back on a picnic table in the backyard of his house in Princeton, New Jersey, staring up at the leaves of a tree, just thinking, how am I going to make this article work? So if we zoom in on one of those particular days in John McPhee's illustrative career, we say like, oh, look how unproductive he is. He's laying there. He's not doing anything. He's not answering emails. He's not getting after it on the typewriter. He's not going into his cold plunge and getting fired up to make sure that he can handle his Notion-powered 17 context to-do list. He laid on a picnic table. Didn't do much. But when we zoom out to the period of a year, we said, oh, that year he produced this great article on the pine barrens. That's what he was working on. And it became an acclaimed article. We zoom out even more to his whole career. We're like, man, over 24 books, a Pulitzer, 2 National Book Award nominations. This guy is productive. So we often use the wrong time scales when it comes to productivity, and that forces us to speed up unnaturally. Now, why should we care about it? Well, this is the second thing I wanted to tell you about what we get wrong about pace. We work in the modern age of offices, in an incredibly unnatural, artificial way. We go to an office 5 days a week. We're supposed to be working hard. This is the dictates of pseudo productivity, at least 8 hours each of those days. And we do this week after week all year long. This is not the way that humans are wired to work. I get into this, both the paleological research, the anthropological research, the historical research. I pull from a lot of different threads in my book to argue, hey, if we look back at the Paleolithic, we have evidence from the studies of extant hunter-gatherer communities that our work was in the scale of just an individual day, way up and down. A really intense period where I'm in the middle of a hunt or foraging, but then maybe hours of a midday kind of break because it's hot, and then another intense period over there. We didn't work hard all day long. And then when we jump forward to the Neolithic, this idea that we would be working all year round at similar average levels of intensity also made no sense. No, we'd work super hard in the fall, the harvest. But in the winter, we barely worked at all. We instead had, festivals and other types of things to keep our sanity when we had no work to do. So there's nothing more unnatural to the long history of humankind than just trying to work all day hard every day, day after day, week after week. These two things fit together. They're two issues with how we think about the pacing of work. To have a more slower approach to work means you need a more natural pace, by which I mean a more varied pace. And I give a lot of advice in the book in this. Some of this is about your own expectations, taking longer on projects, being comfortable with making something the work of the next 10 years and not the work of the next 6 months. But there's a particular section in this book where I get super practical about how to break free from this constant level of intensity type of work that we do day in and day out. And one idea I had in there that I want to relay to you now is to introduce seasonality to your knowledge work or job. Now, seasonality means, like in the Neolithic, some seasons you work harder than others. You get intensity, growth, recharging, natural give and take that avoids burnout and allows you to more fully embrace the human experience. Now, how do you get seasonality if, let's say, you control your job? You're an entrepreneur, you run your own company, it's just you maybe and some part-time, you're a solopreneur, you have some part-time assistants, it's mainly you. Okay, you could just actually take months off. I give the example in the book of my friend and the entrepreneur and author Jenny Blake, who actually does this. She just builds her annual schedule around the idea that she takes 2 months off every summer. Turns out no one cares. Her clients don't know, whatever. This is just the way she works, and it's hugely important for you. But what about if you're not an entrepreneur? What if you work for another company? You can't just take 2 months off. This is the idea I want to underscore here. Quiet quit for a couple months at a time. Now, quiet quitting was this whole phenomenon from 2022 that was a big deal online and then was sort of derided. It was a Gen Z saying, you know what, I'm going to do the bare minimum in my work. Typically, this was motivated by some somewhat half-baked and illy articulated conflict theory, late-stage capitalism type verbiage of I'm more than just my labor, etc. But there is a interesting tactical idea underlying quiet quitting, which is you actually control more than you might realize your workload. you can pull back, say no to more things, be more strategic about what you accept, kind of disappear off people's radars. You can pull back in your work. Now, the problem with quiet quitting, and this is why this movement as a whole faltered, if you do this all the time, if you're always quiet quitting, it will eventually be noticed. Like, what are you doing here? You're not catching our attention as someone who's doing proactive, interesting, good work. We're not promoting you. We're going to fire you. It's not sustainable. But if you quiet quit for a month or two, no one's going to notice. So you can use quiet quitting to actually induce seasonality in your work without your boss actually knowing. Choose a couple months, maybe 1 month, maybe 2 in an already quiet period, and pull back. Come off the radar. Don't take on new projects to start then. Don't feel guilty. This is your winter for the Neolithic, the equivalent of the winter for our Neolithic ancestors. You're just going to pull back. You're going to relax. And then ramp it back up again and do some cool stuff. And feel like, oh yeah, Cal did this really cool thing last fall. Like, he's really on it. If you do this right, no one on the outside will notice, but you will feel it big time on the inside. It is a more natural pace to your work to have this seasonality, and it's going to make everything you do slower and more sustainable. All right, we're ready now to talk about the third and final principle of slow productivity, which is to obsess over quality. Now, in many ways, this principle is the glue that holds together the other principles that we've talked about today. It's what makes slow productivity work. There's 3 things you get when you begin to obsess over the quality of your work. 1, the work itself just becomes more directly fulfilling. Humans get great satisfaction out of doing things at a high level, feeling themselves getting better, getting the rewards of this improvement. That plays right into our motivational centers. It's going to make your work much more fulfilling. 2, if you obsess over the quality of what you do, this is going to force you necessarily to slow down, to put in place the type of ideas we talked about in Principle 1, to put in place the type of ideas we talked about in Principle 2. You cannot get really good at something if you're busy. You cannot get really good at something if you're pegging your intensity at the red line every single day. So if you make an obsession with quality at the core of your approach to work, nothing will seem more well-motivated or natural than trying to slow down and reduce what you're working on. Third, as you get better, which is what will happen as you obsess over quality, you will gain more leverage over your job. That leverage will make it easier to shed extra obligations, to gain more autonomy, to slow down. The better you get, the more opportunities you have to slow things down. So obsessing over quality is like the engine or the glue for everything else we talked about. Now, in my book, I go into details about how to do this and why this is important. I've got some really great case studies there. But I just want to mention one specific piece of advice right now. The key to getting better at something, to improving your quality, it's not just putting in time to practice. It is also improving your taste. If we really break it down, how do you actually get better at something? Well, there's this deliberate practice you have to do where you design activities that are structured to push you past your comfort level and make you better at the activity than you were before. The problem is you need a definition of better. Your taste, how sophisticated and refined your taste is what determines how fast and effectively you can get better. So what you want to do at the beginning of a journey to obsess over quality is to begin to obsess over the masters of your field, to study the work of people that do generally what you do really well, to understand what makes it so good, to become a connoisseur of the people who are much better at what you do than you are yourself. This is not just about paying tribute to those who come before you. It's about improving your taste, because as your appreciation for what your field could be gets better, the speed and effectiveness at which you're yourself able to improve is also going to accelerate. If you're in marketing, study the great marketers. If you're in computer programming, study the great designers of algorithms and code. If you're in writing, study great writers. If you're an artist, study great artists. If you're an entrepreneur, study the more big name entrepreneurs that came out of nowhere and built big industries. How did they did that? Read their biographies, watch documentaries about them, talk to people who knew them. What did they do differently? You want to be a connoisseur of the great so that you can make yourself better. So it's not just about getting after it and grinding and doing hard work. You have to actually improve your ability to identify what is good if you hope to get closer to that good yourself. All right, so that's the third and final principle I want to talk about. Again, this is a crash course. The basics of slow productivity, one idea for doing fewer things, one idea for working at a natural pace, one idea for obsessing over quality. Put those 3 ideas into action and you will right away see improvements in your life. Your approach to work is going to slow down. Your quality is going to go up. Everything is going to seem more sustainable. But if you want the true transformation to the slow productivity mindset, you got to read the book, Slow Productivity, available March 2024. Get that book for the full, detailed, piece-by-piece breakdown of how to do it. But hopefully these ideas get you started moving away from the fast and towards the much more fulfilling and meaningful slow.